everybody, Pat Armstrong here with the newest edition of Increase, the lifestyle vlog for men and the women who love them. You know, during this time of quarantine, I have witnessed the good, the bad, and the ugly. Some of the good I've seen is people who haven't communicated in years getting reacquainted via text or telephone. It's funny how isolation will do that to you. Unfortunately, we've all witnessed the bad as thousands of people around the world have lost their lives as a result of the coronavirus. But even more devastating is the ugly that I've seen. People saying things like, "I don't care how bad it gets. I'll never forgive so-and-so." Or, "I'll never do whatever with this person." Or I've even heard, "It will be a cold day in hell before I ever talk to so-and-so again." And you know, that's so sad. Life here on earth is too precious and too short to have that type of attitude. Recently, I released a video on King David, and if you haven't had a chance to see it, I would recommend that you stop right now and watch that video and then come back and pick this one up. But in the other video, I talked about how even though David did some horrible things, that he didn't let his failures determine his future. Now, I wish I could tell you that for the rest of his life, David never did anything else wrong. In fact, I wish I could tell you he did everything just the way he should have. I wish I could say I do everything just as I ought. But if we're honest with ourselves, we know that's just not the case. And in the video, I mentioned that there were consequences to the things that David had done. And one of those consequences was a constant turmoil in David's house among his children. And today I want to look at some of those instances in David's life and how, because of the way he dealt with them, it led to a huge regret. So we'll pick up the story in the Bible in 2 Samuel chapter 13. And we're not exactly sure how long after David's affair with Bathsheba this incident took place, but we see at this point David has many grown children through different wives. And in this particular story, David's son Amnon expresses romantic feelings for his half-sister Tamar. But he's not sure how to deal with it. And unfortunately, to make a long story short, through some very bad advice of a friend, Amnon ends up raping his sister. Now you can imagine the range of emotion in the kingdom at this time, from devastation on Tamar's part to anger and everything in between. In fact, the Bible tells us in 2 Samuel 13 and verse 21, "But when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth." The king was very angry, and rightfully so. But the problem was David didn't do anything about it. So it appears that Amnon gets away with raping Tamar. Now, 2 years has passed, and Absalom, David's son, and Tamar's brother, was throwing a celebration and invited all the king's sons to attend. What no one knew was that over the last 2 years, Absalom had allowed his anger to grow toward Amnon for what he had done to his sister. And his plan was for his servants to kill Amnon during the party. And because no one suspected anything, Absalom's plan went off without a hitch. But of course, when this happened, everyone else fled for their lives, and even Absalom, being the guilty one, fled to his mother's household in Geshur. Now, when word made it back to King David, he was misinformed that Absalom had killed all the king's sons. But of course, at this word, David was completely devastated. But quickly, David's nephew informed him that not all the king's sons were dead. All of them were fine except for Amnon. Absalom had killed him because of what he had done to Tamar. So David's emotional response to Amnon's murder is understandable, just like his anger when Amnon raped Tamar. But again, the problem is he didn't do anything about it. In fact, the Bible tells us in 2 Samuel 13, verses 37 through 39, that David was more concerned about Absalom running away than he was about Amnon being murdered. And the Bible says this, "But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead." Now, looking at his response to the death of Amnon, I get the impression that David was the type of guy that figured if you ignore something long enough, it will eventually go away. You know, the Bible says he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing that Amnon was dead. So good, you know, someone else took care of the problem, so now I don't have to deal with it. But the problem hadn't been taken care of. The problem was only beginning. For 3 years, Absalom was living with his mother's family in Geshur. And during those 3 years, the Bible tells us that David moped around the palace because Absalom was gone. David's depression was so obvious to everyone that finally his general Joab asked permission to go get Absalom and bring him home. And so David again is thinking, yes, finally somebody else is dealing with another one of my problems, so I don't have to deal with it. Now David was very happy about the idea of bringing Absalom home, but his pride and his unwillingness to deal with his own problems led to this response in 2 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 24. "And the king said, Let him turn to his own house, and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house and saw not the king's face." So now after 3 years, Israel is happy that the prodigal son has come home. But dad won't see him. In fact, it has now been 2 years since Absalom has returned home, and this whole time, David still has not seen his son. David's pride is building bitterness and resentment in Absalom. And finally, out of desperation, Absalom makes an appointment to see his father, but unfortunately, at this point, the damage has been done. And because of David's attitude toward his son, Absalom begins to undermine the throne. He begins to turn the hearts of the people to himself, to the point that many of the people were ready to crown him king. So David gets the news that his son is leading a rebellion against him. But rather than taking care of things as he should have, David decides to run. And the Bible tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 14, "And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword." So for the last 7 years, David has had an issue with his son Absalom. But rather than dealing with it from the beginning, he has decided to ignore it and run from it. But the problem has not gone away and is only getting worse. At this point, David decides to leave the palace in Jerusalem and go into hiding from the conspiracy of his son. Of course, with dad out of the picture, Absalom moves into the palace and assumes the throne. Now, we're not sure exactly how much time goes by with David on the run from his son. But we do know that Absalom realizes that he can't totally assume the throne without taking care of his enemy. So Absalom and his generals make a plan to totally alleviate David and his kingdom. One thing they didn't consider, though, was that David was a warrior and always surrounded himself with strong fighting men. So when David heard that Absalom and his army was on the move, he truly wasn't worried for himself or his people. What he did ask of his men, though, was to deal kindly with Absalom. He knew Absalom and his army was no match for his own army, but he wanted to make sure that Absalom would be okay. Now, I'm sure you can imagine how this made David's men feel. Here David is asking them to deal kindly with their enemy, who has driven them out of their homes, has totally disrupted their lives, and disrespected the kingdom and country that they loved and served. So when the time came, Joab, David's general, put an end to the rebellion by killing Absalom. Finally, word reached the king that the battle was over and that they were victorious. But rather than celebrating the victory and the news that the battle was over, David was concerned about one thing. And he asked the messenger, "Is Absalom okay?" Once David received the message that Absalom was dead, this was his response, according to 2 Samuel 18, verse 33. "And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, 'O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son.'" Unfortunately, the rest of David's reign was overshadowed by the sorrow at the loss of his son Absalom. But it didn't have to be that way. If David would have taken care of the situation all the way back at the beginning with Amnon and Tamar, he would have saved himself a lot of heartache and regret. Now, there might be somebody watching this video, or you might know someone that you have a situation in your life that you need to deal with. Maybe someone has hurt you. Maybe someone has done something or said something to you that has made you angry and bitter toward them. Or maybe there is someone you know who is angry and bitter toward you. And maybe you're not sure why. But let me encourage you to get that taken care of. You know, one thing that we can count on with 100% certainty is that we're all going to die one day. Don't be that person like David that once you find out that person has passed away, you live the rest of your life with regret of not having taken care of the situation. You know, there's nothing you can do about it at that point. So today, I want to encourage you to take care of it by following these 5 steps. Number 1, get it taken care of. Now, I know I'm not in your shoes, and I don't know what's been done to you or said to you, and I'm not going to argue the fact that it was hateful or hurtful, but what's going to be worse is for you to find out that person has passed away and you never got it taken care of. If David would have taken care of Amnon, it would have saved him a lot of heartache with Absalom. Number 2, get past the pain. Now, I'm not going to act like the pain you experienced isn't real. No one, as hard as they might try, is going to understand what you've been through. And I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy, but it is something that is necessary. You can't experience the best life has to offer by constantly living in the pain of the past. And unfortunately, because of David's unwillingness to deal with Amnon, it led to 3 years of sorrow and pain being separated from his son Absalom. Number 3, get over yourself. Now, truthfully, this is an expression that I've never really cared for because in my experience, I usually heard it from a self-righteous person trying to justify their wrongdoing. But I believe for some people, it is appropriate. Some people won't take care of situations they're in strictly because of their pride. Many people may not even remember the circumstances as to why they're angry with someone else, but for the sake of their pride, they won't deal with it. And though David loved his son and longed to see him, he would not because of his pride. Number 4, get the right mindset. Because of David's failure to deal with his son, he allowed his circumstances to control him. David was the king. He should have squelched Absalom's rebellion at the very beginning. But because he had the wrong frame of mind, he decided to run from his problems instead of deal with it head on. Running from your problems won't accomplish anything. No matter how fast or how far you run, your problems will catch up to you. And finally, number 5, get prepared for the future. As I said before, the only guarantee we have in life is that everyone eventually dies. Don't live the rest of your life like David, mourning over the death of someone you regret not getting things right with. You know, during this time of quarantine, isolation, and social distancing, now might be a good time to reflect on your relationships, and maybe it would be appropriate to drop a note or send an email or make a phone call to that person you feel may have wronged you. I know they are the one who is in the wrong, and they need to be the one to take that step. But I want to encourage you to do that so one day you won't have the regrets like David when it's too late.